It was the crows all along. I realized as I was taking down my note that I've got a good category and a bad category, and then way more in the bad category, and it made it seem like I just didn't like this book, which is not the case at all. That was just, I have thoughts. I have opinions. Lots of them. I have a lot of opinions. Hello, I'm Jessie, the sleepy koala, because I'm Australian and I'm also perpetually tired. I am back in my nice and comfy blue chair, which I have decided is my reviewing chair, and it's also my reading chair, so it's my R&R chair. Today, I am going to talk about Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. This is the second book in the sixofcrows duology, and part of the Grishaverse, with the Shadow and Bone trilogy being the base one. This is a side one, and then there is a sequel series to Shadow and Bone. I adored sixofcrows and did a whole review on it, and you can find it linked up here and linked down there. This second book, I do love it. I do. But I think there's a lot of issues in it. As you can see by the number of tabs I have put, I had a lot of things that I needed to say. I actually had to read this book twice because I got through to the end of it the first time, and there was just so much that had happened. And I knew I had some mixed feelings, but I couldn't even remember what half of them were for because there was just so much that happened. So I read it again, and this time put tabs onto the things so that when I eventually went through to make the outline for this video, I would actually know what the hell I'm talking about. Crooked Kingdom starts out at the very end of Sixofcrows, where we have been left in a cliffhanger of sorts, where Inej has been kidnapped by Van Eek, and the other crows are trying to get her back. So we spend the start of the book dealing with Inej's kidnapping and the subsequent rescue of her, which I did very much enjoy and thought that there was some terrific character moments in it, and that there was some very well thought out ways that Van Eek was duped by the crows. After we have Inej back, safe and sound, the crows want to wreak havoc on Van Eek. Understandable. He didn't pay them, kidnapped their friend, and tried to hurt her. They kind of want to hurt him in kind. They go about this plot to undermine him financially so that they can get their money, and also they can ruin his reputation. And that plan doesn't go very well. It really goes badly. Mostly every part of it goes badly. And then after that, they become the most wanted people in all of Ketterdam. And they have not only the Stadwatch police looking for them, but all of the gangs who have banded together to be able to find these six crows. This leads us into the end of the book, where they come up with another plan that has so many different moving parts. It is to help QA, who is the most wanted person probably in the world at that point. It's to help the Grisha, who are underground in Ketterdam. It's to get their money. It's to humiliate and undermine Van Eek. And it's also to screw with Packer Rollins, and maybe more. Those are just the things that come to mind. But they go through this very complex plan, and they get to the end, and they get what they want. Except Matthias dies, which I didn't find super sad the first time. I found the scene at the end with them changing the boat and finding out that he died, that I found really sad. But my first time through, it didn't hit me during his death scene and during his last chapter, and it was only the reactions of the other characters. This time, oh my gosh, I cried so much. I cried so much when I got to that last Matthias chapter. It was heartbreaking. And then I didn't cry later, so I don't know what's going on there. All of this happens, and then the book ends, and our characters kind of go off in their different ways. And I do remember when I first started Sixofcrows, I was told that there aren't really spoilers in it for the main series, but there's a couple of minor mentions of things. I would say Crooked Kingdom has a lot more spoilers in it for the main series. So if people don't want to have spoilers for Shadow and Bone, then this is probably a book to leave till once you're done with that trilogy, which does, in my opinion, would be very hard going from the end of Six of Crows and then having to hold off to then read Shadow and Bone if you don't want those spoilers. So I can very much understand more now what people mean when they suggest reading Shadow and Bone first. I absolutely loved everything with Sturmhond, and knowing that he's Prince Nikolai was really great. I thought his character was wonderful, and it really helped with me going into King of Scars, which I've just started, because now I know his character already, and that makes it really easy for me to go into a new book because I'm not starting from scratch with all the characters. So I love that, but that's a major spoiler. Because I assume, at least from watching the Shadow and Bone show, he is not in power initially, so you know who wins the war. Though, of course, I feel like it's pretty obvious that the Darkling probably doesn't win the war. But also just things like with Genya and the fact that she only has one eye, that she was tortured. But even something like Zoya and Genya being part of the Triumvirate, presumably that is a spoiler. Presumably that comes from the original trilogy. This is the type of thing that it's small, but it's bigger than what's in Six of Crows. Like, these aren't just vague references. These are, here's the consequences from the first 3 books in the Grisha trilogy. And there's also just a bit more information on Alina and the fact that she died defeating the Darkling, which is something some people might not want to know. That seems like a pretty big spoiler for the end of presumably the 3rd book in the Grisha original trilogy. So there's little things like that where they're not Easter eggs because they're too obviously connected. And if someone doesn't want to know these things, then this book is going to maybe disappoint them and upset them on that. So in that case, it might be better for people to read the original trilogy first. This book has a lot of plot happening. It is a very plot-heavy book. If you don't like plot-heavy books, then this might not be the book for you. It is a whirlwind. It's a whirlwind that I enjoyed, but it's a whirlwind nonetheless. But ultimately, I did find issues with this book. I thought it was kind of messy in parts, and I think that there were things that weren't explained as well as I think they kind of should be, or plot threads that just kind of dropped that seemed like they were going somewhere and then they didn't, or there was the plot threads that were brought up and then nothing happened and then they were resolved with nothing happening in between. Those ones really got to me. There was also some more open-ended things, which I feel is meant to be sequel bait, but this is a duology, and it really annoys me if there is sequel bait in a duology. Yes, there might be a sequel series, but if you're dropping sequel bait into a book, then I expect a follow-up in that series, not in a different series. I think that these could have been closed off better so that this story felt fulfilled and whole, while also leaving room for these things to be fleshed out further in a different series, in a future time. What I do really want to praise, though, and I will get to a lot of this in more detail later, is Bardugo's character work and her relationships between characters. It is something that she shined with in Six of Crows, and you learn so much about these rich characters that you can really grab a hold of and hang on to and just love and want to read more of and just want to see that story continue. And Bardugo does fantastically at continuing that in this book. She really fleshes out particularly Jesper's storyline, but she also looks at character motivations for a bunch of the other crows as well. And gosh, it's just, I really loved it. I really, really loved the relationships and the character work that is done in this book, and appreciate the last book for how much character work it did, so that this book had such a solid standing for that character work to continue to be built up. That was fantastic. Relationships, characters, Bardugo does incredibly at these, and she hits that nail on the head in Crooked Kingdom as well. But things, I think, that were done well story-wise. Firstly, the showdown with Pekka Rollins and Kaz, that was horrifying, but also incredible. It was so satisfying, which sounds awful when you think about the fact that it involved pretending to bury a child, which is real bad. It brought the conflict between them to such a nice resolution, and the symmetry that Kaz uses of never really being able to stop thinking about this child for Pekka Rollins or Kaz's brother and imagining them in these awful situations. Kaz got what he wanted. He really got what he wanted. And I just thought that was done really, really well to keep with who the characters were. And it was just so believable that this barrel boss who's so full of himself and confident and cocky ends up on his knees begging. If someone had told me that that happened before seeing the context of the scene, that would just be insane to me. I couldn't imagine that. But I think Bardugo did brilliantly at manipulating how the characters think, and also how Kaz can manipulate other people, and how he just is able to get into their head and also think from their perspective to know what the worst thing would be. That was really well done. Hats off to Leigh Bardugo for that, because that was such a satisfying conclusion. Honestly, that might be the most satisfying conclusion, plot-wise, that this duology has, even more than what happens with the auction and everything that's connected to that. I think also with the auction, there's so much connected to it that it's just difficult to pinpoint which part I like and which parts I don't like. Whereas this is a showdown between two people, and it is done brilliantly. A really small thing that I liked in this book is the explanation of their goodbye, good luck, of no mourners, no funeral. Because it was a cool phrase. Like, I always liked it as a cool phrase that's like, that's pretty fantasy. But there's actually a reason. There's a reason behind it, with the burning of the bodies and the plague. I thought that was great. I thought that was super duper great. Like, that's such a small, well-building thing, and I'm so happy. It's not even a big explanation. It's just like, oh, this is how that ties in. This is how this small bit of world building makes sense in this world. And that's fantastic. That was so good. And just also everything with the plague and Nina and Kaz setting off the siren at the end to clear the streets. That was fascinating. Particularly because we live in the world of COVID, so I think everyone's pretty acutely aware of quarantine procedures and the things that have to be done to try and prevent the spread of deadly illnesses. And it was really interesting to see a case where it was much smaller and confined. And I love how it said at one point that the two weaknesses that Kirsch has are fire and disease, because they are a tiny island. Yeah. That would be a problem. But particularly in Ketterdam, everyone has to go back to their house. And the Sad Watch aren't even allowed to congregate together. They have to split up into smaller groups. And this is so fascinating because it is the much more extreme version of what a lot of the places in the world have done. And they just do it. They just immediately know what to do. And it just makes me think of something like the bubonic plague, except they're on a tiny island and they do kind of know how to deal with it to an extent. I love how much that has been a through thread in this duology. Like everything with Kaz from the first book, and we learn about the Reaper's Barge in that book and the burning of the bodies, and we learn about the Queen's Plague, and it follows it through into this one, and I love that type of threading that happens across book, because I don't know if I would say it was foreshadowing. It was more, here's the world building aspect that's going to be very important later. I thought that was done incredibly well. It was a very smart move to get what they wanted. There are a number of things that I take issue with in this book, and the way that they were done, or the way that they were and I think that these things could have been done better. Firstly, this book had a lot of villains that started out worrying and scary and like they were going to be issues, and then they just either fizzled out or didn't matter all that much. The two that immediately come to mind are the shoe soldiers that have been turned into flying metal people. And we start the book with one of these shoe soldiers taking a Grisha. We are set up from the beginning that these people are going to be a problem, but also it made it seem like they were going to be a much bigger problem than they actually were in the end. And I don't think they were much of a problem in the end. Like, besides the beginning, they turn up for the bridge exchange, and then they just kind of turn up at the end as well. It felt like they were going to be bigger antagonists, and there was going to be more direct conflict with them, besides one of them taking an interest in Jesper, and then just the next time they turn up, it's the final showdown between this shoe person and Jesper. It just felt like they were kind of underutilized, and they just fizzled out for me throughout the story. They weren't that relevant. They were just an antagonist in the background because there needed to be an antagonist for a certain story ending or for something to happen later on. They very much just came across undelivering on the promises I kind of thought that they were giving by the start of the book and what we were opening with. Another villain that is also underutilized, but I also don't care about her, so I kind of just wish she hadn't been there. Whereas the shoe, I wanted to know more about them. Also, we just don't know very much about them and how they are like that. It's something to do with Param and making soldiers, and that's the explanation. And there's nothing more. And imagine it will come up probably in a later book. It just felt like this interesting thing that wasn't explained. And I think it should have been explained at least a bit more than it was. But another character underutilized is Dunyasha, the assassin. I don't know why she was in this story. Literally at all. I feel like the reason she was in this story was because Inej needed to fail walking across the tightropes between the silos. I feel like that was the reason, and this was the solution that Bardugo came up with. But she's two-dimensional. There's barely anything about her. Her personality is, I'm a crazy assassin. And yeah, there's maybe a little bit of extra information there with, but what if she's got royal blood? But this is never looked into any further. It feels like it's been tacked on to try and not have her be quite as much a caricature of a really badly written female assassin. But that's what she is. She feels like a caricature. Like, she doesn't feel like a real person, let alone a character. But she only shows up twice. It's the other thing. Even if her as a character had more personality or something, even if she had turned up more, I'm not sure if that would have been enough to fix this at all, because she turns up twice, and that's it. It's the initial confrontation with Inej, and then the final confrontation with Inej, and the only things we get in between are some sort of vague references of, oh, what happened? Oh, there was some random assassin who was calling herself weird name. That was it. That's just throwaway line to reference her, and there was not nearly enough there for me to think she mattered, think she was scary, think that she would win in any capacity. And it was clear that by the time she turned up again, this was the finale. This was the end of the book. She's not gonna win. And I did love the fight between her and Inej. Nothing to do with her, though. All of it is to do with the dearest Inej, who is the most incredible person. And the things I like about it pretty entirely down to Ineja's character development. But I feel like if the character development was the reason that Dunyasha existed, surely there's a different way. Surely there is a better way than this to have that character development. Because Dunyasha she was pointless. She felt completely useless and pointless. I think in a perfect world, I don't even want her character to be better or her involvement to be more. I just want her not to be there. She was so pretentious in just such a cardboard cutout way. I don't get it. I thought she was bad, and I really was baffled as to why this had been chosen to happen instead of maybe something better. Or at the least making this better, but I'd prefer it didn't happen. That's just me. I didn't like her. Nope. The introduction of Pekka Rollins back into the mix halfway through the book was very abrupt. And I was expecting him to come back because that would be a very big plot to just leave hanging, so I didn't expect that to happen. But just, I don't know what it was. The way it happened just came a little bit too much out of nowhere. And I know the point was it was meant to be a surprise, but it was just a little too surprisey, jarring for me. So the last villain that I thought was set up but not followed through with was actually set up at the end of the last book, and that was Brum, the Fjorden captain of the Druskella. There was clearly some sort of showdown that he wanted to have with Matthias, Nina, the other crows, probably the first two the most, and then nothing happens. He's there in Kenadam at the end, and I know that it was the kid who killed Matthias, but there was nothing that happened with Brum at all before that. And it just feels like there was a conflict that was set up and that we were promised, and then it didn't happen, and you could still have the kid kill him, but have something beforehand, and there's nothing. There's nothing at all. I was pretty annoyed with that, because it was one of the things at the end of the last book that I was looking forward to in this book because it was set up as a promise of happening. It's like if Kaz and Rollins didn't finish their blood feud. It's like if that just never happened. I was just frustrated with the lack of anything, like any sort of confrontation. There's a number of plot threads that I disliked for one reason or another. Some of them I felt were dropped. Others I felt were not actually resolved. I think at least one of them I think is a plot hole. And one of them is just an open ending. Firstly, I hate open endings. There are a few open endings I actually like. But this is Kaz and the Council of Tides. It's set up like sequel bait. It's set up like Brum was set up at the end of book 1 with the crows. And it's like, okay, cool. There's going to be some sort of conflict here, and the next book will look after it. But no, this is a duology. The duology's done. So I assume it will come up at some point in the future. I just really hate how open-ended it was left because it makes it seem like it's going to come up in the next book that doesn't exist. And that's very, very annoying if this is meant to be a completed duology. In terms of plots that I think were dropped threads, there is the poison pill. That never fired. I really thought something was going to happen with that. Otherwise, why include it? I think that was a dropped thread. I also think the discussion that Jesper had with Kiwi about the param antidote, I also don't think that it went anywhere, because they start talking about the Jada plants and Jesper's going on about the stalks. Oh, maybe there's an antidote there. That's it. Nothing more. It's never talked about again. It's never brought up. I imagine it'll come up later. It's just annoying because it feels like this was going somewhere and it didn't. Even if it was just something as simple as Kiwi going, well, when I get to Ravka, I will look into the stock. Cool. That tells me what's going to happen. I don't need to expect anything else to happen in this book. It's going to happen at another time, and I know that we're not seeing Kiwi in Ravka in this book, so it's going to be outside this series. Just small things like that. I don't know, Nina getting rid of the pill and thinking that she doesn't actually need it in the end. There's almost a beautiful, beautiful Romeo and Juliet moment that you could have at the end of Nina knowing she doesn't have the pill anymore and out of grief wishing she did. Just something so that these things aren't just left there and never talked about again. I also got very annoyed with the plotline with Wyland's mother because I thought it was going somewhere and it wasn't. It didn't go anywhere. It was super cool to go meet her, and I loved all of the scenes at the asylum and the stuff afterwards with Wyland and Jesper. I thought that was beautiful. And I really thought that it was going somewhere when she starts whispering Van Eyck under her breath at the end when Wyland's leaving the room. But it doesn't. The story just continues on, and then Wyland uses it as a one-up to his father and then brings her home. And that's it. That's the conclusion. I really am annoyed by this. This could have been really interesting, particularly with his mother obviously knowing she was a Van Eyck, at least to some extent. But nothing happens. It just baffles me why this was set up so well and then left. I would call it a drop thread, except it is kind of concluded with Wyland bringing her home in the end. But that was not satisfying in the least. That was incredibly dissatisfying. That there was just nothing in between. I kind of wanted that. I wanted more in between to know what had happened. Why did it happen? How did this affect her? What actual impacts does this have on the story? Because really, Wyland saying one line to his father about it didn't have any impact except to say, hey, I know. And like, that was it. There was nothing else. Another thing that I was frustrated with was the lack of exploration or explanation of Nina's powers. And I get the whole point is no one's seen it before, but this book just seemed to focus on, okay, she's begrudgingly, slowly learning her powers, but it seems like it's going upwards in an arc and then just stops at the end of the book. We don't learn much else because she leaves and the book finishes, and it just felt like a bit more of a conclusion in this as well would have been really good. I would have loved to get more of an explanation of how her powers worked or what she could actually do. But I do get that there's a lot of other things happening in this book. So maybe this isn't the book to explore it. But I do think there needed to be a bit more to actually put a cap on that so that it was clearer that, hey, we're definitely going to explore this later. We're not just leaving it after progressing through it. I will say, though, on my reread, I did pick up more on Nina's acceptance of it. And I think that aspect is done well of how she has to learn to get through the cravings, but also then live with this power that's the complete opposite of everything she has ever felt or liked or known. And she does get to the point of kind of accepting that. And I thought that was done very well. It was just the actual powers that I think need a little bit more of a conclusion before we finish the duology. If there was another book, it'd be different. But it's not. This is the end of the duology. I think that's what gets me about a lot of these things is it acts like there's another book and there isn't. One thing that I found that Bardugo tried to do in this book that she did in the last book, and it worked very well in my opinion, but didn't work well this time, was have these intricate plots that the characters know about, and they know the details about it, but the reader doesn't know the details. And I think in the first book, it worked really well because there was such a time pressure, and whenever we were in somebody's head, they were just focusing on the tasks they were doing. They didn't have time to stop and think about the next bit of the plan, which was the twist sometimes, but that character was too busy focusing on what they were doing. So we as the reader aren't necessarily going to get the information that gives away the twist, even though the character already knows it, because they're not in the mind frame that they're going to be thinking about it. I know in Six of Crows, the bits that come to mind to me for this are particularly Inej with stealing the gem from Helene and also having to go back to the prison. I know that I spoke about that in my Six of Crows video because I thought that was such a good example of a character knowing information but not sharing it with the audience, but that also being believable as to why it is happening. This book does the same thing, but I do not think it is done well. I just don't think it works because we have these intricate plans again, except the characters know about them days in advance sometimes. This was the case with Inej's kidnapping. They figured out real damn quick where she was, and it's explained at one point that Nina wanted to go after her straight away, but it was better for them to wait, because if they waited, then they could try and trick Veronique at his own game. And Nina wasn't the only one who knew this, they all knew this. Yet, in none of their POVs do we find out any of this at all. And I find it very unbelievable that none of these characters would think about the fact that they know where Inej is, and even though they're holding out for a later plan, surely, even if it's just Nina, she would still want to go. She would still have to battle these feelings of wanting to get her friend and knowing where she is, but having to stop and wait and hold, even though anything could be happening with Inej at that given time. And for characters to know this, but the audience to not, it's just hiding that from the audience by just not telling them because it's a book and you don't want the audience to know. That's not believable to me. That does really take me out of the story, because there's no logical reason that these characters are not thinking about it in their heads while we are in their head. So I don't think this worked anywhere near as well as in the Ice Court. And there are other times where the chapters are written as if a character is thinking one thing and they're not. This happens at the end with Wylan, and when he gets kidnapped by the Dime Lions and gets beaten up because Vanny thinks that the people there are working for Pekka Rollins, when of course they are not. They're working for Kaz. And later, when Wylan turns up, he confirms that he knows this and that he did know it from the beginning. And at no point in the chapter that he is kidnapped, that he is beaten up, is this brought up that he knows what was going on. And I imagine, sure, there is an element here of things happening in the moment, like with the Ice Court. However, it's the way that Bardugo has written parts of the scene where Wylan is beaten up is like he didn't know. And I know that that is to preserve the mystery so that we can have this reveal later that no, it was the crows all along. Sure, it works in story, but reading a character from their POV, and it feels like things are being kept from me simply for plot reasons. And I think that's what it is. They're being kept for plot reasons. But it really annoys me because it makes the characters less believable. It makes me disengage from the story because we have now 6 unreliable narrators, but they're only unreliable because the author needs them to be, not because they as people are unreliable in their own head and in their ways of thinking. That would be awesome. But I don't think that's what this is. I think this is just, we need to maintain the mystery for the audience. So we'll just pretend that the characters aren't going to ever talk about these plans that they know of. Wylan in the church, this scene reads like he didn't know, and he does. Wylan summoned every bit of bravado he had learned from Nina, the will he had learned from Matthias, the focus he had studied in Kaz, the courage he had learned from Inej, and the wild, reckless hope he had learned from Jesper, the belief that no matter the odds, somehow they would win. "I won't talk," he said. The first punch shattered 2 of his ribs. The second had him coughing blood. "Maybe we should snap your fingers so you can't play that infernal flute," Veronique suggested. "I'm here for her. Wylan reminded himself. I'm here for her, his mother. In the end, it was not Nina, or Matthias, or Kaz, or Inej, or Jesper. He was just Wylan Van Eyck. He told them everything. This is like one of those things where something is technically correct, but it's against the spirit of it. And that's what I think this is. It's technically, there's nothing wrong in this scene. Everything that happens technically makes sense, but it's the spirit of it. It's the principle of the matter. Well, my memory card ran out of space, so I had to switch that. The timing was funny because I was just commenting on how so far I have been recording for longer than the entire Six of Crows raw file was. And I'm not even halfway through everything I want to talk about. So I'm glad I'm kind of splitting. Yeah, I'm definitely going to split these episodes. Before we wrap up, friends, I do have one other complaint to talk about. And this one is kind of a big one. And this is something that I really don't like. It is implied in Crooked Kingdom that Jesper's addiction to gambling is caused or influenced by magic. And I don't like this because of the implications it has for a serious disease, illness that he has, that he needs to learn how to cope with, and makes it an easy way out of, oh, just use your magic more or it'll go away. And that seems to contradict with what Jesper's character arc is in this book. A conversation that is had. If Grisha don't use their powers, they grow ill. They age, tire easily, lose appetite. It's one way the shoe identified Grisha trying to live in secret. I don't use my power, says Jesper. And yet, he held up his fingers, enumerating his points as he made them. 1. On a dare, I ate a literal trough full of waffles, doused in apple syrup, and almost went back for seconds. 2. A lack of energy has never been my problem. 3. I've never been sick a day in my life. No, said Matthias. There are many kinds of sickness. Then, later on in the book, we get this passage. Jesper strode down the hall. He didn't know where to go or what to do with himself. Go to the barrel. Stay off the stave. There's a game to be had somewhere. Just be inconspicuous. Sure, as a meanie as tall as a modestly ambitious tree and carrying a price on his head wouldn't be noticed at all. He remembered what QE had said about Grisha who didn't use their power, being tired and sickly. He wasn't physically sick. That was true enough. But what if Matthias was right and Jesper had a different kind of sickness? What if all the power inside him just liked to bounce around looking for someplace to go? I don't like what these two passages are implying. Gambling is an addiction. It is an illness. That is definitely true. But what Jesper is implying and going off what QE said about Grisha who don't use their powers, it has the implication that Grisha that do use their powers don't get these sicknesses. Or at least, don't get sick. So therefore, if Jesper started using his powers regularly, would he just not have a gambling addiction anymore? That bothers me because it treats a serious issue like there is an easy way out if you apply magic. I know it makes me check out, but maybe other people as well who do deal with mental health issues, whether it be gambling or something else, effectively being told, hey, you can be cured. You just need to find some magic. And clearly, from seeing characters like Genya, physical disabilities can't be changed from the looks of it, considering she's missing an eye, but yet you can magically erase a serious mental health condition just by using magic. I really feel uncomfortable with this idea, and something that's I've always loved about these characters is they feel really three-dimensional. Their bad bits are generally pretty bad. Jesper being such a gambling addict that he put up his father's farm, lost his father's farm, is in so much debt that he almost destroys the Ice Court mission before it even starts. And then who knows what else. These are very interesting things in a character in a book. And to just kind of erase the bad bits of a character doesn't sit right with me. I think that that does a disservice to the characters, and it also does a disservice to the readers as well by watering people down, I guess, but also just what it says about how illnesses should be treated. Even if in the story, in the world, maybe you can magically wipe away mental health conditions. It just makes things feel fake in a way that even as a fantasy reader and a fantasy lover, it's not a good fake. It's the type of fake where even though I'm in a fantasy world, I want to know that the characters are fully developed, three-dimensional, and I want to know that if a character has a disease that I can relate to, if you just tell me, yeah, no, just get rid of that with magic, then that doesn't make me feel good, because I still have to live with it, and you've taken that representation away from me. You've taken that character that I could relate to. You've taken that away by getting rid of something that you can't magically wipe away. So I feel uncomfortable with the idea that this is what could potentially happen with Jesper, and maybe it won't, but I find it hard to read those passages in a different way than the one where that makes the suggestion that if he uses his powers, then he won't be a gambler because that is the sickness he is getting by not using his powers. Well, this has gone on way too long. I still need to record part 2 and I am exhausted. So like, comment, and subscribe, and I will talk about happy, positive relationship things next time. Bye!